Hi, friends. Welcome to Unmatched. In today's episode, we're diving into a topic that's extremely relevant in this always on world we live in: the rise of the dopamine culture and its impact on mental health. We're living in an era where the pursuit of the next like, the next win, or the next rush has become almost, well, actually very addictive. Not almost. But what toll is this taking on our mental well being? And how is it shaping the way we view concepts like mental toughness and competitiveness, especially in high performance environments like sports or business? To unpack all these complex issues, we're joined by an expert in the field today, Liz Beecroft-Ridgway. Liz is a psychotherapist, certified clinical sports social worker, and the founder of Mental Sesh. She's dedicated her career to helping elite athletes and high performance navigate the unique mental health challenges they face. And if I may say so, she's one of the most stylish and cool therapists I've ever met. Hence why my cap today, I'm trying to be at the same level. Liz, welcome to Unmatched.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. And thank you for the shout out on my style. I try.
I love it. I'm a huge follower. And by the way, fun story, Liz and I know each other since a while because we've had a very nice event together in New York a while ago and I was at Puma. So I'm very happy to have you today on Unmatched. And I want to jump right into the topic. Let's unpack what dopamine culture actually is and why it's affecting our mental health to this degree.
Yeah, absolutely. So dopamine culture is, more of a term that we've started to shift into in modern society due to technology and social media. It essentially encourages this constant seeking of short-term reward. So when we are feeling the sense of gratification, reward, pleasure, dopamine is released in our brain. And that is a neurotransmitter that feels really good. It can be an addictive chemical. And through technology and social media over the course of the last couple of years, we've learned that we can achieve those dopamine hits at a lot quicker rate than we had to in the past, where we had to gradually work toward goals to earn that sense of gratification or that feeling of being rewarded. And so now what's happening is we are kind of training our brains to search for those quick hits, right? And those quick hits aren't necessarily creating a feeling of dopamine in the longevity. And it's not necessarily something that we're working toward in the long term, but as quick as they come is as quick as they leave. And so we're constantly searching for that quick hit. And what this actually is doing to us is leading to decreased focus, more stress. We're not as motivated. It's impacting our social connectedness. And it's really having an impact on how we are able to achieve delayed gratification. And it's concerning.
The other day I saw this, I read this post, and someone referred to it as digital crack.
Mm-hmm.
And I found it so easy to understand. I was like, oops, okay. Dopamine culture seems not as bad to some degree, but like digital crack was really hitting me when I read that. Is that true? And if so, how do we navigate this reality? Because, it's all about social media these days. And, as marketers, in my case, in our audience, we have to be on social media, right? Like, what are the limits that should kind of like build around us to navigate this?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to, this is something I would look at on a very individual level, and it's questions that we as humans need to start asking ourselves is what are those reward center or those specific rewards and areas of gratification that we're searching for? Is it in career? Is it in social life? Is it in our appearance? Like, what are those categories that we're looking for that feeling, that instant feeling of gratification? And how then do we kind of slow down and allow ourselves to set goals and work towards something bigger rather than going after these small micro doses that we're kind of getting through tech? And that might mean taking a digital detox, setting boundaries around our social media use, setting boundaries around even the people that we spend our time with, right? Like if we're out in a group, and I see this so often, my husband and I will go out to eat and we make a mental effort every time to like keep our phones in our bags so we can be fully engaged when we're, out. But I'll be out and I'll see like groups of friends or other couples, and the whole time they're just like on their phones. And that's part of this detox, is making sure that you can unplug and step away from it, because the dopamine culture is kind of creating this incessant need to be scrolling. Like, people actually have a hard time stepping away from screens now because it creates almost an addictive feeling to getting that next notification, that next like, that next comment. And we need to learn that sometimes, right, like working towards something in the long term equates to even a bigger sense of reward, a bigger sense of gratification. And so for me, what I would suggest is really being strong on the boundaries and understanding other ways that are healthier to achieve those feelings of reward and gratification that does not involve like the dopamine hits through technology or, social media.
What is super interesting about this topic is, first of all, to sort of use the proper language around, what exactly we're referring to, because I think we keep talking about social media and it's not really about being social anymore. It used to be about connecting, right? That was the initial purpose of all these platforms and of social media in general, and now it's more about entertainment,
Mhm.
inspiration, information, or whatever that might be. So there are different categories, but it's not really about connection
Mhm.
anymore. So like, first taking a look at that from, from a little bit of a distance and realizing that you're not really connecting with anyone. And then the question that I really wanted to ask you is, I have this theory that when you're on social media and you scroll like mindlessly, whatever mental issue you might have in the background is accentuated by
Mhm.
the algorithm. So like, when they say, oh, the algorithm is working against me, it's like, no, maybe the problem is you. I mean, whatever it is that you're battling, they're challenging in the background, maybe that's what you're drawn towards watching. So can we unpack that a little bit and explain how that works?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think the algorithm is especially on TikTok, I will say, is incredibly tailored to our how do I say this? To our unconscious, I would say. We might not even be fully aware of that, but for example, like I was watching the Menendez brothers documentary on Netflix the last couple of days, and my whole TikTok feed suddenly is that. And even I wasn't searching anything on it on my phone, but even just like where your phone is sitting on a table, it's hearing, like, I'm convinced it's taking in the information that's in your surroundings. And it's also, there's a lot of on social media when it comes to influencer culture too, that they kind of it can feel like your insecurities are being preyed upon. And I think that's where like brands really, hit the nail on the head sometimes, is we all face insecurities. We all have moments and beliefs about ourselves that we aren't proud of, that we are insecure about, that affects our self-esteem, our confidence. And then when you scroll on social media and you're faced with these people who are the opposite of those beliefs, you have this innate ability, and it's kind of how our brains are wired. We are curious. We want to learn how to be more like them, because it will, in our brains think that if we do what this person is doing, it will change that about ourselves. Like, we just have to start acting like someone else or doing what this influencer is telling us to do, and it will rid those beliefs and those insecurities. And that's actually not the case. It's not how that works. But in doing that, it starts to then push out more content, and that's what we start to see more and more and more of through the algorithm, because we are subconsciously engaging with our own insecurities online. And by doing that, we're creating so much harm to ourselves, and it significantly impacts our self-esteem, our self-confidence, that compulsive ability to want to be on our phones all the time. And we almost trick ourselves into thinking, am I being inspired, or is this something that's telling me I'm not enough? And there was a TikTok, I'll have to send it to you. It was this girl from LA. I think her name was Fiona, because she talked about like Fiona Apple, and she went on to say how she's this big, she's a big influencer, and she was talking about like, I spend so much of my time looking at trends and seeing what the other girls are doing, and she's like, I don't even know anymore if this is me as a person, or if I'm just doing what the algorithm is telling me will work for my career to blow up, to grow. And she's like, and I've lost my sense of self. And that is what I think is incredibly important in all of this, is that the more we scroll and the more brands, influencers, whatever content we're engaging on is preying on those insecurities, the more we're losing our sense of self in all of this. And the more we lose that sense of self, the worse our mental health will only get, instead of taking a step back from all of that and tapping into who we are in our identity, and then going into social media with an intentional use and using it in a way that is healthy, and we're being mindful about the content that we're, looking at. So yes, to say all this, like it definitely
There's
has
a lot to unpack here.
yeah.
For sure. And listen, I will say this, as a marketer, I feel like I am not necessarily part of the problem, but I want to be aware of what we're doing as marketers, and I want to share this on the platform with my fellow marketers and founders who are looking to build brands and are looking to create marketing that actually connects, right? I think the big challenge that we all face as marketers is the fact that we are being told that numbers matter, right? So the volume of the likes and the followers, although lately, the platforms have said that actually engagement is more important and numbers are not so important. But in the end, if you have 1 million followers, that will count for something, as opposed to having 1,000, very mindful followers. So there's a decision that you have to take at one point, whether you're an influencer, whether you're a brand, of how big you want to become. And nobody is in that position of not being ambitious, right? Everyone is ambitious. Everyone wants to grow. The question is, how do you do that in a way that is responsible to what you're putting out in the world? And I want to say this to my fellow marketers as well. Like, I think we sometimes forget that what we put out there to our consumers comes back to us, because we're also consumers, for other brands and other things. And so we become also part of the consumer base that has to be affected and receive those messages. And it's extremely noisy. It's an extremely noisy marketing environment right now, where there's so much competitiveness and, so much that we have to absorb. What would be your point of view, from where you stand? How could we do this in a more responsible manner?
I think, obviously, like I'm not expert in marketing by any means, but from a mental health perspective, I think it's always important to define your why, your pillars. What are those values that you have as an influencer or as a brand, as a marketer? Like, and how do you want to tell those stories in a way that is ethical, has morality behind it? It is scary today. There's a lot of trends I'm seeing. Like, it's just less about brands and their identity as a brand and following those pillars. And I feel like every time I'm online, it's just at least from the social standpoint, it's a lot of brands just jumping onto the next like social trend that's happening. And for me, it seems like, oh, they're cool. They're, on a surface level, they're cool. They're staying up with the trends. They know what's going on. They know what the Apple dance, they know all these things that are going on that the kids are doing online. And yet when I take a second to think about it, I'm like, well, what is this brand about? How are we tapping into that? And I think where we're headed, it's concerning, because I feel like a lot of brands are forgetting that, and they're not necessarily staying true to like their core values, and maybe sitting out on some of those trends that don't align with their mission or their purpose. And I think it really takes the time. It's really about like, okay, how do I redefine, how do I revisit what those pillars are and what we stand for? And how do we, find the trends that feel like it's a natural fit for us to, jump in on? And then where do we, sit on the sidelines and bow out? And I think that it feels very forced right now. And I think it's really important for brands to have a sense of values, a sense of purpose, even for influencers, right? Like, what are the topics that you want to discuss online? How do you make sure that you're not triggering anyone, that you're not putting anyone's safety at risk? And hey, if that means like working with different professionals from those other areas and consulting with them on those things, and so be it. But I think there's so much noise right now, like you were saying, that I think we're losing the sense of self in all of that, as who a brand is, who influencers are. I think everyone is just kind of like clones of one another online, and sometimes standing out, even though you're not following the trends, you're not doing the same thing everyone else is doing, is actually a way to create more positive change or inspire other people to do the same. So, yeah.
What I was thinking while you were talking was that actually, from my experience, it starts to seem like heritage brands actually do a much better job
Hmm.
at being responsible with that.
Yeah.
Just because they come from a different, kind of background, they've had just more leeway to build their brand, and they don't have this urge to gain as much attention as new brands that are coming up. Whereas as much as we're saying and we're praising these new, young, up and coming, fresh, cool brands that have such a easy way to connect with the new generation through using that exact language that you were talking about and knowing exactly what the kids are all about and the slang and the trends and everything else. But it feels that it's almost like more focused on gaining attention. And then the question is, what do you do with that
Hmm.
attention? Of course, you're converting into sales, but how long term of a thinking is that? Because obviously consumers also change over time, they evolve.
Hmm.
And as much as we talk about Gen Z right now, in a couple of years they're going to be forgotten and we're going to be focusing on Gen Alpha, right? And then there's again the rush. Is there a better way? I mean, again, talking about ambition and scale, of course traditional brands have much bigger scale and resources to work with. What should a young up and coming brand focus on in an ethical, way to prioritize mental health, among other things?
Yeah, I think when it comes to mental health, it's, I've seen this so much since the pandemic, this sentiment of it's okay to not be okay. And I think that's great. But I think we need to take it a step further, and actually give people the tools so they know what to do when they're not feeling okay. We've kind of, for lack of better term, beaten a dead horse with that saying. We can't keep telling people it's okay to not be okay and then not give anyone else, not give people the next steps. How to find a therapist, work with therapy directories, work with therapists who can direct people in those directions, work with therapists or mental health experts to discuss how to handle a therapy consultation, give people resources, tools, like practical, concrete things that, even if therapy is not an option, therapy is very expensive. It's also very hard right now to find a therapist that will take insurance or that even has openings on their caseload. And so sometimes it's like, hey, we're partnering with this expert in mental health to create a journal and have it be something that is actually a useful, tangible tool. I think it's really giving people those tools that they need to understand how to navigate their mental health in ways that feel like a good fit for them, giving options, but also that fit with the brand. Like, don't force anything if it's not in alignment with the brand's values and purpose. But at the same time, I think we need to do more than just slapping a quote on a t-shirt and donating a portion back to a nonprofit. Like, we need to actually give people tools, directions, concrete, tangible steps to take in all of this. And in doing so, that means not only working with influencers who are mental health advocates, but actual professionals who can speak on those topics and actually can give a little bit more than just the slogans, that you typically hear from the advocates. The advocates are kind of limited into, sharing their story or giving, the generalized information. Whereas when you work with a professional who has, the stamp of a license behind them and has to abide by an ethical code, we have a little bit more leverage on the ways that we can tailor and provide mental health information to the masses. And I think both are equally important. It's just figuring out, like, from maybe it's like campaign to campaign or whatever that looks like, which are you trying to be specific here? Are you trying to just raise awareness? Like, what is the purpose when it comes to mental health? I think that's a big thing I find with a lot of brands, as well as, like, brands will come to me and say, hey, we want to do something for mental health. I'm like, okay, well, what about mental health? Like, is it mental health of athletes, mental health of creatives? Is it mental health of high performers, women, men? Like, there's so many subcategories under that umbrella of mental health. It's not a one size fits all type of thing. And so I think the more specific you can get when discussing mental health, the more impact you're actually going to have.
That's for sure. And one thing that I want us to focus on before we move to the second aspect of it, which is more the environment of high
Mm.
performance and how that affects us all. But I want to stay on the topic of living in this dopamine driven society and explain with as much detail as you can what are the the consequences long term, because I think here's my theory. I think that we haven't seen it yet. We haven't seen the effects, right? Because this is quite new. This is happening to us in real time. We haven't had any case of early stage Parkinson's disease or any other real mass issue that we can pinpoint to this exact topic. So I think we're living in a bit of a denial of what the actual circumstances, and we've been just yapping around for the last 20 minutes about, dopamine and why this is, but let's be very specific. Why is this bad for
Yeah,
us?
this is bad because if we don't learn how to continue to accept long-term gratification and we only focus on the short-term quick hits, it's going to increase levels of anxiety across the board, levels of stress, levels of depression. Our ability to connect with others is going to significantly decrease. You think about just forming a friendship, right? That doesn't happen overnight. That is something that you have to invest in. If we're so used to quick instant gratification because of dopamine culture, we're never going to be able to really fully connect and form lasting bonds with new people that we meet from here on out. We might have those relationships that we've already established, but it's going to be incredibly hard if you're not, because you don't always get instant gratification right off the bat from new people you meet in your life. It's also going to impact our self-esteem, incredibly impact our self-esteem and confidence as a society if we're not able to find that validation from within and we're only looking externally for people to validate and affirm through likes, comments, etc., then that's going to be a big issue as well. We're going to feel depressed. We're probably going to isolate ourselves more, which means we're not going to be as social. Our means of connecting with people is going to turn into tapping a heart. And that's sad because tapping a heart does not really get you to understand anything about that person, right? Like you have to ask those questions. You have to put that energy into that. It's going to impact our ability to just prioritize the short term versus the long term. Working toward a goal is going to be something that most people won't be able to do anymore, because if we don't have that short term validation, why would we want to set a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan? Because we're not going to get the instant gratification right back. We're not going to be able to sustain without that urge to have that gratification. So there's a lot that it will contribute to, mostly anxiety, depression, high amounts of stress, very low self-esteem and confidence, and our ability to connect with other people.
And I would assume a lot of other neurological problems, issues, illnesses that are very much connected to stress.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I wouldn't be shocked, I obviously there's no research out there as of yet, but if there are increases in ADHD diagnoses and as well as OCD related diagnoses because of that. Because when you think of just the ability to focus, right? Like in your attention span, like that is also going to play a role in, how people, when we're not getting those quick dopamine hits, our attention, we're going to be, looking elsewhere constantly and kind of mentally juggling a lot of different things to try and focus on, which I think can not necessarily be classified as a technical ADHD diagnosis, but it's going to look similar. It's going to be very confusing. And even with OCD, this compulsion to feel like you need to be on your phone to be validated, and this obsessiveness with that external validation, those likes and scanning for engagement. I think there's probably going to be an uptick in some of that as well.
Which is very sad and concerning. And I really hope that I want to be an optimist, and I want to think that younger generations will do it better because they've seen us make this mistake. And I feel like every younger generation sort of observes and then does things differently. And I hope there's a new wave coming with, kids today in understanding what those issues are, and maybe taking a different route. But I want to switch a little bit the gears here and talk about athletes, which obviously you're an expert on, and you work with athletes quite a lot. And one of the things that I'm observing lately, and I wanted to chat with you about, is that we see them being glorified so much by media and brands, and especially obviously due to their achievements. I mean, there's so many good examples out there, and of course, definitely very deserved, praise that they get. You see, examples like Serena Williams and Usain Bolt. I mean, they've achieved so much, but they also had a lot of pressure when they were kids in order to get to those places. And they talk about that quite a lot. But somehow it feels that that's almost like put on a pedestal, that sort of obsessiveness of being in a performance state all the time. And it kind of gets trickled down onto the entire world. And us as consumers seem to have to put ourselves almost like at the same level as them in how to act and how to work and how to feel and what to achieve and how fast or how strong we need to be. How healthy is that? And is there a better way to talk about this to the
Yeah.
public?
I mean, it's extremely unhealthy. There's actually studies that they've looked at with the Navy SEALs, talking about like this idea of mental fortitude and mental toughness and pressure and to push through it, and how that is actually the worst thing you can do in moments of high stress and pressure. It actually decreases your optimization and the level of performance that you can achieve when you're pushing through and you're not allowing yourself to stop and take a break and focus on the mental well-being aspects of it. Now, with you saying, Serena, a lot of athletes, right? Like that is something that they have learned their everyone has a different threshold when it comes to how much pressure they can endure. And for a lot of athletes, especially elite athletes, their thresholds are much higher than most people who are not elite athletes, because for years and years, their entire lives, they've been training. And just as much as you train your muscles, you can train your mind to take on more pressure, more pressure, more pressure. But there's actually, whatever that threshold is for you, it looks different from person to person. There's a model, it's called the Yerkes-Dodson law, and it's just an upside down bell curve, talking about optimal levels of stress and arousal in people who are high performers. And when you have pretty much non-existent levels of stress, your performance is actually going to be low because you need some stress in order to perform. Having a decent amount of stress in the middle is where highest optimized performance area will be. And then when you have too much stress, that's where your performance then decreases again. So basically the analysis of this is that we need some level of anxiety, pressure, and stress in order to perform well and be at our best. But we also have to understand what that looks like on an individual level when that threshold gets crossed, and knowing when we need to take a step back. And so when it comes to pressure and mental toughness in athletes, I think, as much as we can emphasize that, I think it's also emphasizing understanding what your threshold is, understanding balance, right? Like knowing how to not just tip the scale over really far in one way, that like when you're approaching that threshold, you gotta balance that scale back again, and you gotta be able to rest and recharge. And I think sometimes we highlight these athletes who overcome, these high amounts of stress and pressure and adversities. Not to say that that isn't amazing, because it is. But at the same time, we're not highlighting all the other things that they probably did at the same time, like give themselves a break, have to recharge, have to recover. There's a lot of the mental side of things that I don't think get discussed enough in those journeys. So yeah.
And especially because I'm pretty sure that in the work that you do with athletes, you come across the actual effects of that pressure on their mental health. And I know that you post a lot about that on Mental Sesh, and I agree that part is not really discussed. It feels like it's a little bit of a taboo. It's almost like the unpopular part of being an athlete and of high achievers. And I feel like as a high achiever myself that went through that mental preparation throughout my entire life, hence why I can handle it right now. But it's been over literally 40 years of my life, since the beginning of building it up and sustaining that. I can tell you, it's come with a lot of anxiety and having to go to therapy and having to work on figuring out my own boundaries to be able to function at the normal pace, where once you get to that normal pace, you also realize that actually for a normal person operating in what I call this sort of the genius, almost that mix, right, of the right pressure that you can operate at the optimal level of your potential doesn't mean that you have to go the extra mile. You have to push yourself to a limit that actually has a potential impact on your health, physical health and mental health. Why don't we talk about that aspect enough when it comes to athletes and that pressure that they get?
I think there's this unspoken message, especially with athletes, right? Like, if I admit that I need to take a break, that I need rest, that I need to step back, that I need to honor myself in any of those ways, that I'm weak, that I'm not strong. And there's also this incredible social pressure, right? Aside from the pressure to perform, there's a social pressure in today's world with social media. These athletes are put on a pedestal, and there's so many expectations from people who don't even know who they are as a human, know them like on a human level, know anything about their lives other than who they are as an athlete, that leaves them feeling that they have to meet these expectations for people that they don't even know, because that's where how their story is being told publicly. And it's a shame, because I think there's there's a very stigmatized belief that athletes are not allowed to struggle mentally, that especially elite athletes who are making millions and millions of dollars, because I hear this all the time, and especially being in Philadelphia, being a Philly sports fan, I see it all the time, is, you're not allowed to have a bad game because you make X amount of money, which is not realistic whatsoever. That you're not allowed to sit out for your mental health because you make X amount of money. The amount of athletes that actually have to lie about being on the injured list and saying it's knee soreness, and I'm not saying any time you see knee soreness, it means they're actually sitting out for their mental health, but there's a lot of times where they are listed on the injured list for certain things that have nothing to do with what's actually happening, and it is because of their mental health. But it's things like that, like, we should be able to say, hey, I am not feeling mentally my best right now. And if I go out on the court, I'm actually doing a disservice to my teammates, to my coaches, to the organization, to the fans, whoever, by trying to push myself through this. Because if I go out and play when I know I need a minute, I need to recharge, it's better to sit out one game than to enter a game, try to push yourself through something, and potentially develop a physical injury because you're not completely focused on your environment in that moment, or to overflow that threshold and then have to sit out more games because you're either injured or you're really struggling mentally for whatever reason. But yeah, there's a huge stigma around admitting defeat in the sense of mental health. And so it's very hard to get athletes to understand that saying that you need to take a break for your mental health, or you need to prioritize your mental health, does not mean you are weak. It means you're incredibly strong and brave, and that you are prioritizing one of the biggest components to the sport that you play. Just as much as a sport is physical, it's extremely mental as well. And I think as a society, we have a really hard time accepting that and understanding that.
Because guess what? We're humans, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
and I don't know why it's so hard to register this. It feels like we need some superhuman type of examples to look up to. Otherwise, we can't function well as a society. It's really weird. But I was thinking about the example of Simone Biles and how actually, probably she had that perception when she did it, but then she was met with such support. And even now, coming back to the Olympics, it was so so elevated, this topic, in a positive way, I feel. And I think it was a good example for maybe just everyone in the world, to see that, and see that it's okay to take a break, that it's okay to to put your health first, get better, and then go back to being competitive again. And it's okay, and life goes on. It's like in business and in life. I mean, I remember when I took my maternity leave, I thought that my career was going to end, and I decided to come back earlier because I was in a leadership position, and nobody told me to do it. It was just my own bias and my own pressure and anxiety in my head, thinking the world is going to end for me if I don't do it. And then you realize that you're back and actually nothing has changed.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think we just need more examples like that in the world.
Absolutely, absolutely. And yeah, I think, the more that we glorify this idea of like pushing through the pressure or being overly mentally tough, it actually is doing all of us a disservice, because it's sending the message that we need to sacrifice our well-being in order to be successful. And that's not the case. We should never have to sacrifice our mental health or our physical health for success. We can, like you said, take a break. We can, recharge, and it does not mean it has to be one or the other.
I feel that element of success has to do more and more with these idea of productivity.
Mm-hmm.
And I want us to spend a few minutes to talk about that, because I feel there's such a essentially a huge lie around productivity and what that means. As in, productivity typically is associated with being able to do more. And fun story, years ago, I was this, I call it like I was a to-do list girl. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I was so happy to have like a huge to-do list. And at the end of the day, it was my biggest pride to be able to look at my list and see how many things I crossed over. And that was the level of success and productivity that meant, yeah, I did great today. I did so many things. I don't know what happened to my brain, but I always tell this story like right now, tapping into my creativity more, I feel like I constantly live in a creative chaos. Like, I'm not able to do a to-do list for the life of me, and I'm more chaotic than I've ever been, yet I feel like I can achieve so much more because I tend to tap into where my energy
Mm-hmm.
leads me, and I just like feel that I need to focus on something, and I give it my best, and I focus on that one thing throughout the day, and then at the end of the day I feel like, yes, major achievement, because magic happened, because guess what, I loved it, and I put my whole energy into it, and it worked out. What is really productivity? How should we look at that?
Yeah, I think, being productive, right? We equate being productive with usually work. 90% of the time we're thinking, I got to be productive. I got to go after my goals. And there's always some type of, measurable, I guess, outcome or
Yeah, like a KPI.
yeah, in that. And I challenge a lot of my clients to reframe their thinking around that. And productivity doesn't always have to be measured. Sometimes productivity means taking a nap. It means sitting on the couch, eating Oreos, watching your favorite Netflix show that you want to catch up on. Sometimes it means just taking a long hot shower. Sometimes it's doing nothing, turning your phone off, right? Like, we have to reframe the idea that productivity has to equal a certain type of output. And sometimes it should, in my opinion, it should actually be more of an input. You have to pour into yourself first before you can pour out to anything else. So if you think of it as like a system, right? Like, our bodies are a machine, and they're only well-oiled and functioning to produce and be productive and produce something on the output if we are also pouring into ourselves first. We can't pour from an empty cup. That's where all the sayings come from. So we have to think of it too, like, well, if I'm doing everything and everything's getting pushed outward, how am I making sure things are coming inward? And so productivity, the way I kind of visualize it, is like we're at the center of that, and there's the things we're expelling into the world, and then there's the things that are coming into us. And if that's not balanced, then we're really not being productive. And balance doesn't necessarily always mean 50-50. Sometimes that balance is 70-30. Sometimes it's 20-80. Sometimes it's 60-40. But there has to be some level of input in order for the output to be achieved. And so, but I think oftentimes we think of productivity means we're crossing a task off like that to-do list, or we're getting something done that we're working toward, but we're not pausing and thinking about, well, how are we carrying ourselves across that finish line, and what do our bodies need in order to do that? Like, you don't run a marathon without drinking water. You don't do a lot of those things without nourishing yourself in the process of it. So that's what I would say how we need to look at productivity.
And also with this, again, with the sports lens, it's really just a long-term thinking, more of a marathon than a sprint. Because if you're looking at everything as a sprint, you're going to eventually burn out really quickly, and you're not going to be able to maintain the pace at which you need to operate in order to achieve all those goals that we have, right? And our society tells us we need to have really big, ambitious goals. And then for that, you need that that energy. So just to kind of like finish off on this point, how should, sports organizations, brands, marketers like myself look at that aspect of competitiveness, mental toughness, and how should we promote it in a much more balanced, healthy way so that consumers get the positive aspect of it and not the more detrimental messages behind it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's being very balanced in the messaging that comes across. So it's not only focusing on the wins, it's also focusing on the losses and the struggles that were on the way. Normalizing the experience that it's not always 0 to 100, that it's not always a linear path, and really emphasizing what each athlete or each creator does to focus on their mental health in the process of all of that. I think that's something that we don't see a lot of at all is, how is LeBron James still playing in the NBA after all of these years? That's great. And we look at that from a physical lens, but what is he doing for his mental health to help him help him create this longevity in his career? We're not getting the curtain pulled back and really looking at the raw details of it all. And sometimes it's not always pretty. It's not always these success stories. And I think the more we showcase that, the more realistic it will be, and the more people will actually be able to relate to that. And it will only inspire and help motivate people who see that like success really isn't an overnight thing. People really do have to work hard, and they go through a lot of trials and tribulations. So, I think it's highlighting the recovery, the balance, and the vulnerability in all of it, that these athletes especially, there's a lot of vulnerability that goes on behind the scenes, and they're not always these superheroes that we make them out to be.
None of us are, right? And I mean, just coming back to you and your example, you're a founder. You have to be on social media. You also need to put yourself out there. Yet you talk very openly about on your channels about taking a break and putting distance towards certain things. How do you do it as a founder? Just to give this extra inspiration to everyone. Of course, athletes, they have access to this, resources and support. You and I and everyone who is like us also need to go through life and put in those little, support mechanisms to get us through. How do you deal with this on a personal level?
I go to therapy myself, which shout out to my therapist. She really holds it together for me most days. I also, I really value, and I think for me, I don't know if you probably know this. We moved to the suburbs of Philly in April this year. And that was actually a big move, mostly for my mental health, because my environment just got so chaotic after COVID. When I went into full-time private practice, I, had an office in the city for a little bit. And to be honest, like most of my clients are not based in New York, or they're traveling for work, or they're kind of all over. So it didn't make sense. So then I transitioned to being fully remote and virtual. And it got to be very isolating. I don't have like coworkers. And, I needed space and I needed a yard. And so that was a big decision in the move. It also I have ADHD. And so New York City is a very overstimulating environment for me. And I had to come to terms with the fact that I was actually doing myself a disservice, like staying there after so many years, because I would go out, I would become extremely overstimulated in bars. And I think people probably felt like I was either not even in bars and restaurants, at events, wherever I would go out with friends. But I think people thought I was probably being like this huge bitch because I was like staying to myself. And in the reality, I was just so overstimulated, and and then going back to this like tiny apartment in Bushwick, like I never really got the release I needed. And so I had to come to terms with that, for one. And so like paying attention to my environment is a big thing that I do. Two, it's surrounding myself with people who aren't yes men that will hold me accountable when I need to be held accountable, but are also just very down to earth human beings that, when we're together, we're not talking about like social media. We're not worried about what's going on in the digital space. We're just like able to be present with one another. And I think that is very helpful too. And then like since we've moved, I've been trying to just get outside and go on walks, connect with nature, and just do things that I just genuinely enjoy aside from my career or my platform. I, go to a lot of sporting events, which I just enjoy as a fan, aside from my job as a therapist with athletes, but my husband and I, we started building like a Disney puzzle the other day. And so like doing things that connect me back to who I am at my core is also really what helps me aside from all of it. So yeah, that was kind of a mumble jumble of everything.
Liz, I feel like you are talking to me. I feel like that's literally me right now, like trying to balance it all. Found the journey, trying to, share stuff on social media, but not too much, put limitations, live in a small village like I am right now in Germany. It's so not, kind of normal for me coming from Madrid 14 years. But in the end, I realized that actually it's a blessing in disguise because I tend to be overstimulated as well. And I pick up on all these inputs and I immediately, like get kind of crazy with everything. So actually having this quiet life is so, so helpful. Thank you so much for taking the time today to talk to us. I feel like, I hope that the marketers, the founders that were listening to you today got enough input to at least think about their actions, what they put out there, and be more intentional with those messages, at least for themselves to know what that impact is on people, on themselves, on their families, potentially on their kids. I think about my kids all the time. So thank you so much for taking the time. And I hope to chat to you again.
Of course. Thank you for having me.